right? So where do we store this water? Hetch Hetchy, right, in some valleys. What's the biggest water storage system in California? You think it's a non-obvious? Oh, please. Thank you. That's exactly right. It's snow. In the Sierras, if it's not warm outside, it's supposed to rain in the winter, right? It comes down to snow in the mountains, and the Sierra snowpack is a really massive natural storage system of water, right? So it gets warmer in the spring, the water comes down and is used for irrigation. So if in a warmer world, like we have now, this last rainstorm we had that we were all whining about, where's my umbrella, right? So, unfortunately, it was incredibly warm in the Sierra, so a lot of that rain actually didn't fall as snow, but it fell as rain, which doesn't store as nicely as snow does. So in a warming world, you have less snowpack, less natural water storage, and that means you're going to have a lot of water early in the season and less water at the end of the season. So the water supply system is going to put a lot of stresses on the food system as well. Extreme heat has been shown to be extremely bad for soy, corn, cotton, and wheat, right? Rice we're still working on. But for 4 of the major food crops, a day above 29 degrees Celsius leads to huge hits in yields. So what you've got here is not just, technology doesn't just have to keep up with now sort of regular yield improvements, but there are a bunch of effects working in the other direction that technology is fighting against too. So sorry for the 10-minute rant here, but some people look at Malthus as one of these things in the history books. I think working on food systems, water availability, and how we're going to get to this feeding the 9 billion people we're going to have to feed is one of the most pressing issues facing mankind today. So if you're interested in food, don't be embarrassed that you're not into finance, right? Working on food and agriculture is going to create a massive number of well-paying jobs because it will become, or already is, one of the most pressing public policy issues across the world. So, agriculture. I think ag is cool. I was born on a farm. The reason I'm so tall is my mom always put the stroller next to the dung heap, right? So I was well fertilized. Okay. So long-run production. Now let's relax things, right? So now what I get to do is I'm in the luxurious position of being able to adjust both capital and labor. So I'm not bound by, I only have one espresso machine, but you're in the system where you're going to your annual Starbucks strategy meeting, they serve coffee, and now you're planning on, what's the size of your store? Should we have more espresso machines, fewer espresso machines? You get to play this sort of game in your mind where you get to pick labor and capital. So you're planning over a period long enough that all inputs are flexible. So substitution is possible, and what we're going to see is that, or assume, is that there are many combinations of labor and capital that can produce the same output, right? So if you're thinking about a bank, retail bank, that, does one thing, it distributes cash. It's really the only thing I ever do at my bank is, get cash and then send them my monthly paycheck and then pay late fees. But the point here is they can produce cash dispensary services by using a lot of capital, mostly ATM machines and few people, the people who service the ATM machines, or almost no ATM machines and lots of people, right? So you can use different combinations of capital and labor to produce the same output. Which one you're going to choose is, of course, going to depend on the price of those inputs, so capital and labor. But technological, without thinking about what these things cost, I can produce the same level of output using different combinations of inputs. This is very similar to the utility function, where I can get the same level of happiness using different combinations of Reese's and Hershey's, right? That's how we got to an indifference curve. So for long-run production, I can get the same level of output, so output instead of utility, using different combinations of inputs. So in utility theory, it was I am indifferent between different combinations of Reese's and Hershey's. In production theory, it'll be like I'll get the same level of output for different combinations of labor and capital. So like we had a utility function, we have this production function that we've already talked about that depends on your inputs, labor and capital, and maps into a 3-dimensional function of output, which is, of course, a cardinal quantity, not ordinal like utility was. So what do we got here? I'm very proud of this graph. It took me a while to do it. Actually, now that I look at it, it looks kind of shitty. But it took a long time. Picking colors that look good on a projector, well, it just shows I have not very good taste in color. But what I've got here is I've got capital on the y-axis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So capital increases going down, and labor increases going to the right. So 1 unit of labor, 2 units of labor, all the way to 6 units of labor. What I've done now is I've plotted the production function. You could do this in a graph, like a 3D graph of utility, but what I'm doing here is I'm just giving you the numbers of how much output you're producing with each one of these combinations. So if I use 1 each, right, I get 10 units of output. If I use 2 each, I'm so creative, you get 20 units. If you could use 3 each, you get 30, 4 each, 40, 5 each, 50, 6 each, 60, right? I just make these numbers up. But then I went out and said, let's not just look at the sort of symmetrical thing, but if we look at 2 units of capital and 1 unit of labor, I get 14 units. If I add another unit of capital to my one worker, I get 17 units. If I add another unit of capital to my 1 unit of labor, I get 20, another unit 22, another unit 24. So this here holds labor constant as you go down and you add more capital. As you go across, you hold capital constant at whatever the number is in the y column here. And as you go across, you add more labor. So what you're seeing here, if you're trying to make the connection between the short-run total product curve and what I'm showing you here, what each row shows you, for a given level of capital, what's the total product. So if I hold capital constant at 3 units, and I have 1 worker, I get 17 units of output. I add 1 more worker, I get 24 units of output. I add 1 more, I get 30, 1 more 35, 1 more 39, 1 more 42. So this row here tells me the total product for different amounts of labor for a given level of capital. So when we did the short-run total product curve, this was listed as a column where we, for a given level of capital, 3 units in our case, it was 8, so there would be a row down here somewhere, increased the amount of labor and looked at what happened to total product. So if we wanted to read the marginal product of labor for 3 units of capital of this graph, if you go from 1 to 2, marginal product would be 7, 2 to 3, marginal product would be 6, 3 to 4, marginal product would be 5, 4, 3. Right? Average product is the same thing. So capital, at using 3 units of capital, average product here would be 17, 12, 10, and so on, and it doesn't divide as nicely anymore. But just to make that connection, what we did in the short run is we locked ourselves into one of these rows. But now, in the long run, I get to no longer consider capital to be fixed, but I get to vary it and see what the output choices are. So marginal product, as you go from, if you have 5 units of capital versus 3 units of capital, is probably going to be different. Right? So going from 1 to 2 units of labor at 3 units of capital is going to be, your marginal product is going to be 7. At 5 units of capital, you go from 1 to 2 units of labor, your marginal product is 10. Right? So what your marginal product is for each additional unit of labor depends on what your level of capital is. Right? So this is a different short-run scenario. This is a short run with 6 units of capital. This is a short-run scenario with 3 units of capital. But now you get to plan over the whole scenario. You're perfectly flexible. You don't only get to go across on this table, but you get to go across and up and down to make the best decision for your firm possible in the long run, because now you get to choose between capital and labor. Now the cool thing that happens here, and that's why I picked these numbers, there are different ways of producing 14 units of output, right? For this production function here, you can produce 14 units of output with 2 units of capital and 1 unit of labor, or you can produce 14 units with 2 units of labor, 1 unit of capital. You can produce 24 units of output with 1 worker, 6 machines, or 2 workers, 3 machines, or 3 workers, 2 machines, or 6 workers, 1 machine. You can produce the same level of output using different combinations of inputs. Again here, 35, 6, 2, 4, 3, 3, 4, and 2, 6 give you 35 units of output. You can play this a little bit more. Here's the 45 one. There's a 49 one in here too, a 55 one. So there are different ways of producing the same output. Again, if you think back to utility theory or consumer choice, right, we had the same level of utility for different combinations of goods. So tables are boring, right? That's a universal truth. Even though it's not so ugly, but the 2 blues don't match, so I should fix that at least. So instead of drawing this as doing these numbers and having to highlight the same amounts of output here, I could do this graphically. Now I'm going to introduce you to something called isoquants. Right? Anybody here from Greece or speak Greek? Really? Come on, somebody. What does iso mean? The same. Somebody speaks Greek down here. So iso means the same, or iso, right? So iso is the same. What do you think quant means? Quantity, output, right? So I'm going to introduce you to something that I'm going to draw that has the name same output, all right? So they're going to be curves that live in a space where on the y-axis I have capital, on the x-axis I have labor, and these curves are curves that have the same output at each point. So let's draw these. So I'm not going to draw the ones from this table. I'm just going to make some up, all right? So this is not directly matched to the table. But I'm going to go with a firm that maybe has isoquants that look like this. So this firm, I'm making it up, can produce 10 units of output by using 10 units of capital and 1 worker, 6 units of capital and 2 workers, 4 units of capital, 3 workers, 3 units of capital, 5 workers, 2 units of capital, 8 workers, and so on. So at each point on this isoquant, this firm is producing 10 units. Right? I'm going to repeat myself here for the nth time, but isoquants are different from indifference curves, even though these look very similar. Right? Looks like an imperfect complement, imperfect substitutes, indifference curve. But an indifference curve at its label has utils. Right? So at which point are you indifferent between different bundles? So each indifference curve is valid for a certain level of utility, which doesn't mean anything. It's not traded anywhere. It's a made-up thing. Versus the label of the isoquant actually means something. This is units of output. This is 10 Ford C-Max hybrid in pearl white. All right? There are things that you can sell in markets and trade in markets. So isoquants, an isoquant is a curve that has the same amount of output on each point on the curve. So if I want to draw the isoquant for 20 units of output, again, I'm just making these up. These things are going to look something like this. So again, what you've got here is you've got different, in math you call it level sets. They're different slices of the production function that tell you different combinations of input that produce the same level of output. Curves further away from the origin on a straight line, right? Again, we would draw our array from the origin to get that one straight line happening here. So in isoquants, on a straight line, thank you very much. That was very nice of you. Not. Can take any ray from the origin. It doesn't have to be the 45-degree line. But isoquants that intersect that ray at points further away from the origin are isoquants with higher levels of output. Right? I think that's all I'm going to say about isoquants at this point. Question? What rules apply to the same way as indifference curves, not crossing and so on? I'm going to give you all of that. All right? Give me one more slide, or maybe 2. Could be 3. But I'm definitely going to answer all of those questions on one slide. Okay. So isoquants versus indifference curves. Right? How are they the same, and how are they different? So isoquants have very similar properties to indifference curves in some ways, but not in others. So isoquants, we've already discussed that lines, isoquants that cross a ray from the origin further away. Sorry, slow down, Max. Isoquants that cross a ray from the origin at points further away from the origin have higher output quantities than isoquants closer to the origin. Right? So further out means more output. They never ever cross. Right? So there are no new rules for isoquants than for indifference curves. So if you're drawing something that looks like an indifference curve, it doesn't cross other indifference curves. Same thing for isoquants. And they're also downward sloping, and I'm going to show you formally why that is the case. We'll do some math in one of those little fun proofs that you love so much. How are they different? Well, isoquants hold cardinal things constant. It's output, right? It's not utility. It's not some made-up quantity. So the label on isoquants actually means something. They're physical quantities, so if one isoquant has the label 10 on it, and the next one up has the label 20 on it, that means the 21 produces exactly twice as much output as the first one. Versus for indifference curves, if one has 20 utils as its label, and the lower one has 10 utils as its label, that means that the higher indifference curve gives you more utility than the low one, but you can't compare the 20 to the 10. It doesn't mean you're getting twice as much utility. It's just a ranking, right? So isoquants are cardinal. Indifference curves are ordinal, right? Everybody here knows what cardinal and ordinal means by now. Okay, so did I answer your question? Good. What types of isoquants are there? The beauty about producer theory is this stuff is very similar to consumer theory in terms of the types of pictures you draw. So isoquants come basically in 3 shapes. All right, the way to remember this is capital always goes on the y-axis, labor always goes on the x-axis. The first type of isoquant we're going to draw is called Cobb-Douglas. Like a Cobb salad, different Cobb, but Cobb, okay? Cobb-Douglas isoquants look like imperfect substitutes. They're the ones I just drew for you. They look something like this. Nice and downward sloping. All right, so the Cobb-Douglas isoquants are downward sloping, they're nice and bent. They signify that you can actually substitute between inputs, right? Depending on what we'll see the relative price of inputs is going to be, will determine if you're going to run with a more capital-intensive production process or with a more labor-intensive production process. But you can substitute between capital and labor, right? Firms like Cabs, it's always 1 unit of capital and 1 unit of labor. They can't really substitute unless Apple really is working on a driverless car, which I hope they're not. Okay, I'm suspicious of that for now. I'm old school. But the point here is this is a production technology that lets you substitute between capital and labor. Cabs are more like one driver, one cab, so that's not a good example of a Cobb-Douglas. But a bank is potentially a good example of Cobb-Douglas. You can choose to use a lot of capital or a little labor to dispense cash, or a lot of labor and a little capital to dispense cash, or half-half. You know, have half tellers, half ATM machines, or Mac machines for our friends from the Midwest. So what's the cab production function? Actually, I'm going to rewrite this in big letters here because nobody ever knows how to spell this. Learn this one. Leontief, all right? It's like the movie Leon and then TF in the end. So Leontief, very, very famous Russian mathematician. In fact, some of the best mathematicians in the world have always come and continue to come out of Russia. Funny story, in grad school, my office mate was Russian, or he still is Russian. And every time we came up with something, he would either yell that, some American claimed it and a Russian name, insert favorite Russian name, had come up with it 50 years ahead of time, so we would laugh at him and then he would get the Russian publication translated and he was actually right. But Vasily Leontief was one of the greatest mathematicians, economists to ever walk the face of the planet. So we've named these isoquants, which is a production process he first described, after him. So these are Leontief production isoquants, or it's a Leontief production function that gives rise to these isoquants. These look exactly like perfect complements, right? So a cab is a good example where you need 1 unit of labor and 1 cab in order to produce a day's worth of cab rides, right? You need it in fixed proportions. You could say, well, Max, I could use 2 cab drivers, right, that each do 8-hour and 12-hour shifts, and you're wrong. Okay, what I mean, in a day's worth of cab service, you need 24 hours of 1 driver, I don't care what his or her name is, right? And you need 1 functioning cab. San Francisco seems to have trouble with this concept because there are no cabs. But the point here is it's fixed proportions. So for these production processes, can you substitute between labor and capital? The answer is no, you can't, right? So there are some production processes where you can substitute and some where you can't. The other extreme, of course, are so-called linear production functions, and we don't see those a lot. In fact, I don't really have any great examples of this one, but just to be complete, this is like the perfect substitutes production process. Why are you messing with me? Linear. Okay, this is a linear production function or linear isoquants. It's like perfect substitutes and difference curves, where you're willing to substitute labor for capital 1 for 1, and you will either produce your output with all capital or all labor, depending on the cost of the two, as we'll see in a second. But if you go back in your slides and your fancy wireless device and look at the pictures I drew when we first met in difference curves, if you have to go back to that slide, you're in trouble for the midterm, by the way. But the point here is we did the same thing for indifference curves. These were imperfect substitutes, perfect complements. In production, Cobb-Douglas, linear, Leontief. So you have to learn 2 new names: Cobb-Douglas, salad, and the name of the airplane, right? And Leontief, I don't know how to teach you that one. You're just going to have to memorize it. So if I tell you somebody has a Leontief production process, you immediately come up, oh, I got it. How awesome am I? I'm not the first one to come up with that. Hey, Noah, 6-year-old is learning the alphabet. What letter is this? All right, Leontief L. There you go. You got it. Oh, man, this gets better. Cobb-Douglas, you finish and it's a C. Oh, I could go all day. All right. So one thing I want to talk about is for a lot of firms, it matters how easily you're able to substitute between capital and labor, right? So if it's harder for you to do that, that gives you fewer options. If it's easier for you to do that, that gives you more options. It's again the yoga theorem, right? The more easily it is to substitute between things, you're potentially better off to changes that we will study, like changes in input prices. So I need to define a concept here. The rate, which defined how willing you are to substitute between Reese's and Hershey's, we defined as the marginal rate of substitution. It was the slope of the indifference curve at any given point, right? And we showed that that's equal to the change in capital, the change in Reese's over the change in labor, or equal to the slow down, Max. Marginal rate of substitution was defined as the change in Reese's over the change in Hershey's, right? How many Reese's are you willing to give up for 1 more Hershey's? We then did a bunch of fancy math and showed that that's equal to the marginal utility of Hershey's over the marginal utility of Reese's, right? And then we showed in equilibrium this is going to be equal to the price ratio, which was the slope of the budget constraint, which had the name marginal rate of transformation. In producer theory, we get something similar. We're going to look at the slope of the isoquant, and the slope of the isoquant measures the ability of a firm to substitute from capital to labor. So how many units of capital can you give up if you buy 1 more unit of labor and produce the same amount of output, right? So how many units on the y-axis, in the old way of thinking, that was Reese's, do you give up in order to gain 1 more unit of Hershey's? Here, we're going to figure out how many units of capital can you give up and by hiring 1 more unit of labor. It's the same concept, only now we have different labels. So this is something important, right? So if a firm's going to try and figure out what their optimal input mix is, they're going to go through different scenarios. I can produce 100 cars with this much capital, this much labor, a little bit less capital, a little bit more labor, and keep on going, and it's going to figure out what its optimal production process is going to be by ultimately minimizing the cost of those input combinations. But before we get there, and to get to that optimal point, and that equilibrium is going to be very similar to our consumer choice equilibrium, we're going to have to formalize what the marginal rate of technical substitution actually measures and what it actually means in terms of the concepts we've learned so far. So exactly how I related the marginal rate of substitution to marginal utilities, I'm going to relate here the marginal rate of technical substitution, the slope of the isoquant, to the marginal product of labor and capital, right? So we're going to get a very similar result here for these firms. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, just like the marginal rate of substitution decreased as the marginal rate of substitution decreased as we went from Seattle to Miami on our indifference curves, the marginal rate of technical substitution